Genesis 37. We will be considering primarily verses 18 through the end of the chapter, 18 through 36 this time. The title of the message is Profound Betrayal. Profound Betrayal. Why don't we read the entire chapter? Why don't we pray and then read the entire chapter? Wait till everybody's situated again here real quick. All right. Heavenly Father, we are gathered under the banner of Christ, one who gave his life for us, rose from the dead, is now seated in heaven, where he intercedes for us, and he rules all things for us. You gave him as head over all things to the church. And from that position, we ask from him and we ask from you that you would open your word to us. Give us today treasures from your word. Help us to see the glory of God in these events that took place. Help us to understand who you are and the way you deal with us and the way you bring your plan to fruition. To draw lessons for our own lives in these things. We don't want to be passive readers, but we want to actively sit under your word as it washes over us and as we think about the God with whom we have to do. And so we pray for effectual work among us. Amen. Well, Genesis 37, beginning in verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors, or a long-sleeved robe. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, Well, they've gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. And then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, The boy is gone, and where shall I go? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. And then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted and said, No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. All right. There's a lot that happens in this text. By way of review, I want to quickly rehearse the main points of what we've seen so far in this Toldot section, the Toldot of Jacob, the generations of Jacob. We've covered this section for 2 messages already. In the first message, we considered that there were 3 main problems that have presented themselves as obstacles to the promises God made to Jacob coming to fulfillment. You might remember that those promises were something like, they boiled down to, among other things, one of the chief and important ones for our stories here, is that Jacob would, together with his children, share in the blessings of God and the goodness of God, and would together, as a united group, begin this course of becoming a nation and preparing for inheriting the land one day. And this is the idea. And as obstacles to that, you have 3 main things. First of all, the violent, deceptive, and disobedient character of at least 10 of Jacob's sons. That these men are just awful. And so the unity doesn't seem too likely, too good. They don't seem to be too good of candidates for bringing God's blessing to the nations. That's one obstacle, the character of these men. Secondly, the extreme favoritism that Jacob placed upon Joseph is a huge problem. And the conflict and the hatred it created in the hearts of his other sons all being capped off by this distinguishing coat that was made for Joseph, this coat of honor that was given him, whether it be multicolored and just a very expensive in that way, the way it conveys honor, or it would be a long robe in the way that it conveys honor that way and marks him out as not wearing a workman's robe. And so this is the obstacle number 2. How are we going to all be together as a cohesive nation and unit and grow together when we have the majority of us are violent murderers and self-seeking liars, and then the other one is hated by all of them because he's so favored by the Father? This does not look good. And the third issue is that added to that, so you might say the brothers create problems, and then Jacob and Joseph kind of together create problems. Jacob mainly by the favoritism, and Joseph by just enjoying it and the way that he does. But then God adds obstacles as well by giving Joseph these dreams, which Joseph then turns and shares about his eventual supremacy over his brothers and even over their father, their common father, and their mother. All will come and bow down to him. And so it's created a real problem. All of this mixes together to create a violent jealousy and bitterness in the hearts of Jacob's sons toward Joseph. That was the first message, essentially. We've got massive problems to the Word of God ever coming to pass. The second message we considered essentially verses 12 through 17. And there we considered Joseph as the obedient and faithful son. He's presented as a model of sonship by Moses. And he is contrasted by the actions and the attitudes of his brothers. So you just we see in that section, one, the setup for what happens today in terms of setting the scenes and what's going on. He's on this errand out all alone. And it's an ominous ending to that where he's out wandering the desert alone looking for his brothers who want to kill him, and he's very unwitting about it. It doesn't look good. Like the stray who's gone apart from the herd, they're the lions ready to attack because that's the easy one. And that's Joseph out by Dothan. It doesn't look good. But the brothers themselves are just persisting in this unreliable way that they've been living. And so this is kind of where we are. We've become more entrenched in the conclusions we've begun to draw about the brothers and Joseph. We're seeing them as opposite ends of the spectrum. One is just this honorable son. He is honored, and some of that is undeserved. Maybe he didn't deserve it initially, but by now he has deserved the place of honor that he has. He's rightly been selected as the heir apparent. And the sons, meanwhile, are worthless men, violent, given to rage, they're self-centered. It's not good, and disobedient. And so these are the two sides, you might say, of the story. So we left off, we saw Joseph wandering about near Shechem looking for his brothers and his father's flocks, when some stranger just happened across him and was able to point him on to Dothan, where the boys had said they were going. So Joseph continued on to find his brothers, journeying toward Dothan. He's now some 65 miles from home, probably with little supply of food. He's alone, looking for his hate-filled brothers in order to report on them to his father. That's the other thing. He's not there to say, hey, I'm here to help. He's there to look things over and examine them and then go back home and talk to Dad again. This is not good. And so we begin then in verse 18. And now the scene's changed. Instead, we've been kind of watching over Joseph's shoulder, and now we're over in the camp of the brothers and hearing their conversation as they see Joseph pop over the horizon, and they recognize him pretty quickly. So verse 18, they saw. So let's divide the message today into two parts. And I don't know, maybe that's not particularly helpful, but I want to talk about it in terms of two scenes. First of all, the scene near Dothan, which is here, verses 18 through 31. And then the scene near Hebron, which would be 32 through 35, I said 2 parts, we can add a third. Then there's a postscript, verse 36. Okay, so basically 2 main parts, and then there's this little bit at the end, verse 36. So the scene near Dothan. Verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Again, note that the perspective has shifted away from Joseph and now to the brothers in the camp. It's not really an official camp. It's not as though they had set up and had been here for years or months even, but it's the kind of camp that shepherds set up as they travel along their way, right? They set up a little, some spot to shade themselves, perhaps a couple animals, somewhere to set a fire, something to sleep on under. They're there near Dothan, and they'll be there for a little while. It's more like a mobile kitchen and a place to get out from under the sun. Note the brothers' quick action and response. I don't know what the landscape is out there exactly. I mean, I've read books and looked at pictures and stuff. I don't know exactly where they are and where the nearest hillside is and how far it might take someone to come from the hillside to me. But let's just say it's a few miles even. That's a long ways away to recognize someone. Maybe it's a mile. Maybe it's 2 miles. I don't know how far it is. Maybe the terrain is such that it's a mile away, but he's going to have to travel 3 miles to get here, because of the way the terrain is. Something like that. I don't know exactly. But they see him, and before he gets to them, they see him, they recognize him. Before he gets there, they've had this whole discussion that they're all in agreement they're going to kill him. This is really, it's quick. They didn't waste any time. It did not, notice this, it did not take from Joseph coming to their camp and saying, hey, Dad wants to know, and they said, we're not dealing with this again. They just saw him, and they're ready to kill him. It didn't take any further aggravation on his part. Just the fact that he was there wearing the coat was enough. Let's end it. Let's kill him. It's remarkable how quickly they conspire together as to what they will do. And the consensus is not to rough him up, but to kill him. To kill him. It's been a long time, but I've been around people and witnessed when a group of people are very angry with someone else and that person comes around and they jump them. I've seen it. And it was violent. But it wasn't murder. They weren't planning murder. But it was awful. This isn't that. This is far more. They mean to kill him. Now, the discussion can't begin until they recognize him. How do they recognize him? Well, maybe because of his gait, right? The way that he walks maybe is a certain way. He tends to walk a certain way. Maybe they was close enough they could recognize that's that coat, or it looks a lot like that coat, right? Very possible. That coat of honor and the way that he walked and whatever else it might be. Maybe the satchel that he had with him. Something told them. But before he arrives, there is a whole series of discussions that take place. A number of discussions that take place. First, there is a plan that is devised, and that seems to have been devised by the group. Because they conspired together, it said. And then Reuben, who seems to have been absent for that plan, arrives, probably because it's getting close to lunchtime. He hears their plan, they talk to him about it, and he has his own idea and suggests it to his brothers who weigh in, and they decide, yeah, that's a better idea. All of this happens before Joseph arrives to their camp, their makeshift camp. Before, it says, he came near to them. Look at verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. All of these discussions happened before he got there. So this is interesting. So what do they say? So in verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And then verses 19 and 20 explain what just was summed up. they conspired together to kill him. What was the discussion? What were they essentially saying? What was the plan here? What did they conspire exactly to do? They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. This is verse 19. Here comes this dreamer. You can hear the biting irony in that statement, can't you? Here comes the dreamer. Here comes this dreamer. That irony is made all the worse when you read the commentaries about this statement, and it seems like the word itself means something more than just dreamer. Dreamer is a fair translation, but it'd be more like the dream master, or like the Lord of dreams, or the Lord in his dreams, you might say, right? I mean, the dream Lord. Like there's a guy who plays for the Boston Celtics, name's Robert Williams, and when he was first drafted, they have these team meetings that you're supposed to make, like, okay, you've been drafted. Now, look, today's Friday. On Monday at 10 o'clock, we have a meeting here. We've bought you plane tickets. Everything's ready for you to go. You just need to show up, And so what happened? He slept in and missed his plane. And then they got him there, and then at a hotel, and he slept in and he missed the meeting, like the next time. And then he had a press conference, and he missed the press conference because he slept late. So he has the nickname in Boston they call him the Time Lord. And it's just mocking the fact that he can't keep himself on schedule at all. Like they have someone that just keeps, their whole job is to get him places. It's ridiculous. They call him the Time Lord. Like you don't mean that because he really is great with time. It's so this is the dreamer. Here comes the dreamer, right? Here comes the Dream Lord. And it's not, he's the master of dreams. And it's amazing. So let me just read from a very respected Hebrew language resource, Brown, Driver, and Briggs. And this is their entry for it. The word it doesn't appear in our translations because it just says dreamer. There's two words that are combined to say dreamer here, right? And the one word is dreams, one who has dreams. And the other one is this other word I'm getting ready to talk about. The word can mean owner or husband or lord. And then it says, so it gives different entries. Owner, another one is a husband, another one is citizens or inhabitants, the one who possess kind of this area, that's their realm. And then there's rulers and lords, and then it gives this one. It could be a noun of relationship, put with another word, used to characterize something. i.e., that is, for example, master of dreams. It's like, I wonder what text they got that from. And that's what they mean. Here comes the master of dreams. Here he comes. Right? The one who has all the dreams and he's got all these ideas about what he's going to come. That's the way they characterize him. They don't say, hey, there's Joseph. They say, here's the dream master. That's the way they talk about him. That's amazing. Here comes this dreamer. I don't know why the translations don't translate it that way. Here comes the dream lord or the master dreamer or the dream master. Because I think it helps to emphasize the pejorative nature, the way they look down upon him for having those dreams, and they hold it against him. Because it just told us they hate him all the more for his dreams and for his words. And it's very relevant when they even call him the Lord of Dreams. The guy, it's just so clear there. And I hate that it's not in our translated that way in our text. Now verse 20. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. It's very important that you understand that. Well, I was getting ahead of myself in my notes. So let's say this first of all. They say, come now, hurry. Let's get all this together and decide how best we want to do this. We don't have much time. He's coming. What's the plan? What are we going to do? How are we going to kill him? We're going to make an end of this dreamer. How will we do it? So that's the first bit. Come now. Then they say, let us. It demonstrates this let us, this conspiring together that was already said. The shared hatred of all the brothers together. None of them felt that they were alone in their murderous hatred for him. They didn't say, hey guys, I don't know what you want to do, but I'm telling you, stay out of it. I'm going to kill him, and you guys aren't going to stop me. It wasn't like that. They all talked and said, let's kill him. Let's end this. None of them felt they were alone in their hatred for him. No one thought to just convince the others to stay out. Rather, as a group, they were ready to pounce upon him at their first opportunity and needed only to consider what the immediate situation allowed them to do to him. How might they spring into action against him? Kill him, throw him into one of the pits, say a fierce animal has devoured him, and see what becomes of his dreams. I say there are 4 parts to their plan. And if we don't think about that plan having 4 key parts, you'll miss out their motive and their approach and everything. And so I want to just think about that is the plan. There are 4 elements to the plan. The master dreamer's coming, and we have 4 elements to take care of this man. Number 1, kill him, which would be an immediate gratification for their jealous hatred, right? It would just end it. We would kill him. And then what will we do? Secondly, after we kill him, we will dispose of the body. We will throw him into one of the pits, it says, or dispose of his body so it would not be found, right? Might be a way of covering the blood so as not to invite divine vengeance from Yahweh or any other so-called gods, right? Covered the blood, covered it up, right? Now these pits, you may have something that will tell you it's possibly cisterns, and I think that's really exactly what it is. These pits were dug out. You know, when we think of digging a cistern, we think, getting a shovel and just digging a big hole and the water kind of drains in it. But what do you do when it's limestone everywhere? How do you dig a pit? You get a hammer and a chisel and you start carving away out of the rock until you have this big hole down there. You might start out where there's already a natural basin, but you dig it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to hold lots of water. And you build even channels let's say you got a big area, you might even carve out little channels out of the ground, out of the stone, where when water will come, it will hit that channel and go down then into the cistern where you have lots of water, not just the water that would naturally run into it. And so these are the kind of things that happen. And so you have these dotted throughout the landscape in these places. And there's one such pit here. A pit is a good translation to describe what it might look like physically, but it's a bad translation if we're trying to think what its function and purpose was. It's a cistern. It holds water. Now, they throw him into there. That's the next plan. So first we'll kill him. Secondly, we'll throw him into one of those pits. Third, what's our story going to be? Well, we're going to have to say that some animal killed him. And so that would include some kind of evidence, right? So they're going to lie to their father to avoid his further wrath and anger by explaining Joseph's death as a terrible and gruesome tragedy at the hands of some wild animal, right? Some evil animal did this. Fourth, this is maybe the most important, then we will see what becomes of his dreams. See how it works out then. He's dead, body disposed of, nobody will ever find it. Cover our tracks by lying to Dad and anybody who asks. Keep our story consistent, guys. Let's talk about it. What's the story going to be? And then we'll see what becomes of the dreams. So that's the plan. Put an end to the favored life of Joseph and to their second-rate sonship, to finally put down this possessor of dreams, whether they were God-given or not. We're going to put down this possessor of dreams as a sheer act of our will and power. He will not rule over us as his dreams have indicated. We won't have this man to rule over us, right? That's exactly what they're saying. What will become of his dreams then? Let's see how we bow then. Now, let's stop and consider this for a second. If these boys enact this plan, they will succeed. I mean, if they kill him, this isn't going to work. If they toss him into one of these pits after they kill him, and nobody ever even finds his body, they're going to get away with it. If they tell this lie to their dad and he believes it and everything goes on, they're going to get away with it. And they never will bow down to Joseph. Something has to change. Something has to change. So this was their first conclusion. Until now, Moses told us that these sons had conspired together to kill him, and then he explained for us what their thinking was. Now the story picks up in verse 21 with new developments again, moving the story forward. So verse 21, but when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So now Reuben has heard the plan. Well, where was he before? Well, it seems like he was absent for one reason or another. Very likely, he was on some chore, maybe as a shepherd. Maybe he was tending the sheep, looking for water in the cisterns maybe. Maybe that's why he knew, hey, we could just pitch him in the cistern. There's no water in there. Or perhaps he was returning from Dothan where he was buying supplies, or maybe causing trouble like they've done before. Or he's up to something else. Perhaps he was delayed in returning to camp because of any number of reasons and just now arrived. We don't know. But Reuben heard what they were saying. He comes into camp and says, hey, this is what we're going to do. Joseph's coming. We're getting ready. This is what we're going to do. Here's the plan. And he says, I think I got a better idea. He sees a way to use this to his own advantage. He convinces his brothers of a better approach. The risk of killing him with their own hands, as satisfying as that would be to all of them, was that they could be possibly incurring blood guilt upon themselves. And we know from the Bible that even to this day, the blood of righteous Abel still cries out. A better plan would be to cast him into the pit or the cistern carved out of stone, right, for runoff water in these dry areas. There would be no escape from such a pit, and he would surely die, but they would not have technically shed his blood. Like I never had to wipe blood off of our hands. We never had to cover any blood up. We just got rid of the body. So wouldn't that be as effective? And there's some advantage there. So why don't we do that? And it's like a distinction without a difference, right? I mean, if I were to say to you, don't murder your brother that way, murder him this way, that's better. You would think, what kind of counselor are you? Right? But this is the sort of equivocation that sinners do, right? I mean, this is how sinners, and I don't mean like those sinners out there, I mean just like people who try to justify a sin or who want to commit a sin, there's one level they think, oh, I wouldn't do that, but I would do this. Like, this is legit. I can see why I should do this, but I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I would kill Joseph. I'd be willing to kill him by throwing him into the pit, but not by hitting him with a rock in the head. Like, that wouldn't be good. Or I wouldn't stab him. I wouldn't stab him in the back, but I'd blindfold him and lead him into the hole. Like, I might be a murderer, but I'm not a terrible murderer. This is the way it is. Every inmate in prison is better than his cellmate. I'm not that bad. You think I'm bad. I had a cellmate who such and such, right? Every employee is better than their coworker, right? They're just better than they are. Every sinner is more righteous than their associates. That's the way it is. You just ask them. They'll tell you all how much, as bad as they might be, they're more righteous than their neighbor, than their friend, than someone else. This form of murder is better than that one. It's less bad somehow, less guilt. God wouldn't hold us as accountable for the loss of his life because it wasn't bloody. So that's probably better. Regardless, well, let me say this. We can, in one sense, look at them and think that is so foolish for them to think that way. In another, there is something, it is less gruesome, right? I mean, it is a little less gruesome. I don't say that as a credit to them, but it does just say that like they're all thinking, if he just died, that would be enough. Like I don't have to see his blood all over the place. Right? I mean, that's a little credit. That doesn't save them from blood guiltiness, but it is something. It is a distinction. We don't want to say that there is no distinction there. It's the kind of meaningful but yet somehow insignificant distinction that we talk about when we talk about God looking at sin. People say all sin is sin to God, and that's true, and all sin is deserving of hell. And yet there are degrees to this stuff, and that it is worse for some people in hell than it is for others. No one has an easy hell, but some people have a worse hell, right? Because of their sins. Jesus says as much. It'll be worse for you on the day of judgment than for, so can be a reality. God makes distinctions, but all sin is still sin. So regardless of the way he equivocates here and offers one form of murder as opposed to another, that wins the argument. It's convincing enough for the sons of Jacob. We know they didn't mind shedding blood. Think of this. They had gone in and shed blood in that town in Shechem before. These were some murderous men. At least a couple of them were, Simeon and Levi. I mean, we know they were ready, at the drop of a hat, to shed blood. But spilling the blood of their own brother may have been seen by them as possibly inviting a level of guilt or a level of ire from whatever gods might be concerned with what happens. So this is perhaps a better approach. Maybe it's not that it bothers me so much to shed blood, but maybe, one of the gods would not approve. And so this is a way to possibly escape that. I'll just read quickly. There's a number of texts we could look at, but I'll just read quickly from Psalm chapter 9 and verse 12. Says, speaking of God, "For he who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted." It's like, it'd be good maybe not to shed blood. If we're going to kill him, let's not at least be shedding blood when we do it, if that's possible. Now, as for Reuben himself, there's certainly some question with regard to his motives. Most often, I think people read this story and they think, oh, Reuben's the hero. He tried, but he was foiled in the end. He tried to save him. He rescued him out of their hands. And it says twice, once that he rescued him out of their hands, right? Verse 21, "But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying," and then at the end of verse 22, "that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So it sounds initially at first reading like he's kind of a hero, an attempted hero at least. It didn't pan out, but he tried to do the right thing. But let me just ask you this. Look at his motive in verse 22. "That he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." Let me ask you this. And what would that have looked like exactly? Let's imagine this. Reuben leaves camp again for a little while, biding his time until he thinks the other sons have moved on. Then he goes out to the pit, drops a rope to Joseph, pulls him out of the pit, and then he's got to get back before the brothers know. So they take off running. They make as much speed as they can. They rush 65 miles back to Jacob to declare that he has rescued his dear son from the clutches of his evil brothers. I saved him. I did that. That he alone cared to save his life and restore Joseph to his father. That he's not like the others. He didn't do that. He rescued Joseph out of their hands. Remember, this is the same man who has lost his firstborn inheritance due to his evil act of lying with Bilhah earlier, seeking to wrestle away control of the clan from his father Jacob. This is a calculating man, a political man, a scheming man. And he says, I got an idea. He tells them one thing. Hey, we would be less guilty. He lies to them, right? He says, we would be less guilty if we murdered him this way. And it's like, okay. It's kind of, I don't know why you're saying it that way, but I can see that. All right. Fine, we can do that. They toss him in. And then he shows up later and he's like, he's gone. This isn't going to work. But the plan was this. So surely this would be a way to get back into his father's good graces. This scheme by Reuben is no noble effort to rescue his brother in order to save his brother. Rather, it's an effort to use the hatred of his brothers against them in order to secure for himself his father's forgiveness and his prominence among the rest of the brothers. At great cost to them, they're going to have to face any number of consequences when he tells all. I mean, they tried to murder. That's more than a bad report, right? This is terrible. That's his plan. He is shrewd. He's very self-concerned and false toward his brothers, all of them. He sees delivering Joseph not as an act of love for Joseph or an act of love and faithfulness to his father, but as an opportunity for reward and for reinstatement. And his later statement that he makes in verses 29 and 30 bears this out. Let's skip ahead for a moment. Verse 29 and 30. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, which is a sign of mourning. He's not saying, "Oh, my brother, he's gone." He tears his clothes and returned then to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" He says, "And where does that leave me?" He just says it and it's like, you can imagine the brother's like, "What do you mean it leaves you?" He's like, was that out loud? Yeah, it was out loud. Like, you can't help it. He says, "And where do I go? Now what am I supposed to do?" And you can imagine it wouldn't take long and they'd say, "What do you mean, where do you go? What does this have to do with you?" It wouldn't take long and they kind of, what were you planning, Reuben? You've been a schemer since we've known you. We shouldn't have listened to you. What was the plan? Well, don't worry, it doesn't matter because we got rid of him anyway. So you're not going to get to do what you wanted to anyway. So just understand, Reuben's no hero in this text. I don't really have any other way to read it. So back then to verse 23. So they decided this is what they're going to do. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. So now the plan's put into action, right? Joseph has drawn near, and these brothers of his get very physical with him. I don't think there's any other way to think about it. We do not read directly about them striking him, pushing him, throwing anything at him, kicking him. We don't read about any yelling or spitting or slapping. We don't read about any tears or any laughter. But there's no way they just walked up to him in silence, took off his robe, walked him over, and just threw him into the pit. That didn't happen that way. Now, the text doesn't tell you that you should think of it like that. But because the text doesn't give us all those details, we usually don't stop and think, what would that look like? We usually just say, okay, they did that. And so it has the effect in our minds as though they did just do that. They just walked over and took the robe off and then he just jumped in or something. And that's not what happened. That's not at all what happened. And we know at least more than what's reported happened because turn with me to Genesis 42 and verse 21. Genesis 42 and verse 21. This is now the brothers they're before Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph and he knows it's them and he's kind of making them realize that they're in trouble. And in verse 21, and they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning. This is 20-something years later. Some negative things start happening in their life that they can't explain, and they say, God is getting after us because of our brother. And listen, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. He was begging them, no, right? And they wouldn't listen. So we at least know that happened. So what does the scene look like when he's begging them, pleading with them to stop? They see what is described as the distress of his soul. He's in anguish. He gets a sense of something at least of what's happening here. It's a physical thing. You can be sure that these kinds of things went on, that he was struck, that he was pushed, kicked, yelled at, that he was yelling. There might have been some slapping, someone spitting, people laughing at the dreamer, tears in his eyes, maybe tears of hot anger in theirs as they finally get to do what they've wanted to do. This was an emotionally charged moment. There was simply no way to strip. The first thing they do, he comes near, they strip him of his robe. And it doesn't just say, it reminds you again, the robe of many colors that he wore. That honorific robe, they stripped it from him. This was, I think, their first act against him for a couple reasons. But we can be sure there was no way to strip this robe off of him without violence. You had to get physical with him. And so now you've got the robe off of him and he's there writhing on the ground. Why did we do this first? First thing, it was an offense to them that he wore this robe at all. Get it off of him. It represented the eventual fulfillment of the dreams. Right? I mean, it didn't come after the dreams, it came before the dreams, but I mean, he got this, and by getting this robe, it was kind of Dad saying, this is the one who's going to be in charge. And then he has dreams, says, yep, it's definitely going to happen. God's saying it too. No, it won't. And they take that robe, which is kind of this visible representation of all that, and they rip it off of him. The second reason they got to take the robe is because it was their plan to provide some evidence that he'd been killed by a wild animal. And this was a necessary part of that plan. It was the only, his other clothes his undergarments wouldn't be distinguishable as belonging to Joseph, but this coat would. You imagine they start taking it off. Why are you guys taking it off of me? Shut up, Joseph. Dream master. Right? This kind of thing. They took him and then threw him into a pit. The pit, and it says specifically, the pit was empty. There was no water in it. If it hadn't said that, you might have thought because it's a cistern, maybe he drowns in there. Right? But it was dry. This is not good. It's not the rainy season. The deep cistern is empty, and Joseph is now thrown into this pit, just as Jeremiah was thrown into a pit like this later in Scripture. So Joseph is as well. Apart from a rescue, there's no getting out. Well, now that Joseph is down there, you can imagine the sorts of things he might be shouting at his brothers to release him and to free him. Perhaps the words, God sees you, my brothers. God knows what you're doing. You won't get away with it. You can't do this. Get me out of here. Don't leave me like this. Right? Or maybe he's ignorant of how serious they are, even though he knows they mean to do him harm, but maybe he's ignorant of how serious they are. Maybe it's, okay, guys, enough. Let me out now. Right? You've had your fun. Who knows? Perhaps he thought they were just roughing him up, trying to teach him a lesson. He didn't yet know for sure that they meant to leave him to die. It's hard to know. He probably could tell by the look in their eyes, though. There's a difference between someone who's coming to do you harm and someone who means to kill you. And so maybe he saw a look in their eye he had never quite seen before. Then look at this, verse 25. This is amazing. Then they sat down to eat. What? What do you mean? Hey, are those sandwiches about ready yet? Yeah, they're ready. All right, well, let's eat. Let's eat. I mean, isn't your heart pounding? Aren't you worked up emotionally? How can you eat? They were so cold toward him. They hated him so much they couldn't speak a word kindly to him. And it didn't bother them at all to toss him into the pit, leave him for dead. Done. I'm starving. Let's get on with the rest of the day. What an amazing thing. Imagine having just acted in this way. They sit down to eat. The callousness of their hearts toward him, that they can do this sort of thing to him and then sit down and eat together and not be bothered by it. It's like hunters that, they kill a trophy buck and they go back to camp. They're not bothered by it because it's an animal that you kill to eat. That's what it's for. But then they tell their stories about, like, did you see how, this is the big buck. Did you see how many antlers were on it? Or how many points were on it? How many antlers? There's 2. I'm pretty sure it's just 2. Right? And the size of the rack, what did it measure? This and that and the other. And the other one's saying, well, man, I let it go because I thought I'd see another one and I didn't. I should have got it. And they're telling all their stories, right? Fishermen going, they all got their stories. And they're there and they're talking. Did you see the look in his eyes when I grabbed him? Man, when we ripped that rope off, and boy, he didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, you can imagine what the talk is. Can you still hear him? Oh, shh, quiet. Yeah, he's still yelling. Yep. I mean, you see, it's this sort of thing. Go check on him. Is he still trying to get out of that? Is he still trying to climb that part of the wall? He is. But that was hilarious. It was five times we watched him. He just kept trying. He's never going to get out of there. Poor little baby, little dream master. What becomes of his dreams now? Right? This is the way their conversation would be around camp, around lunch as they eat. Well, the brothers look up. The second time in the story now, they've been at camp and looked up and seen somebody coming from afar. And they see a traveling group of nomads passing through that area. From the distance, they can tell that they're Ishmaelites of some sort. They were on their way from Gilead. That's the way where they were approaching from. They could see their camels were loaded down, and the customary goods of the time, as they would be carrying, would be gum, balm, and myrrh. And typically they would travel down through that area and make it our way down to Egypt, where they would sell their goods. And so it happened enough that you could see this and you would know, oh, that's what's going on. Right? When I see barges on the Mississippi at certain times of the year, I know it's a barge full of grain. I know that's what it is. When I go to Continental Cement and I see there's a barge there, I know it's got cement in it. And they're shipping that thing all over the world, that powder all over the world. This is what they're doing. So they see, here it is, and you see a prime truck driving down the highway, it's got stuff that gets sold at Amazon. It's going to an Amazon warehouse somewhere. This is the way it is. So here you are. You see these guys coming up, and you recognize by the way that they're dressed a little bit, or in the camels and the way they're traveling, oh, that's Ishmaelites, and they're carrying their goods and they're coming through. They're going to head on down to Egypt. That's the way they always travel through here. And so here they are. And once again, they make an evil plan. So Judah said to his brothers, verse 26, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. And let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Now, so Judah has an idea. He's like, wait a minute. We can sell him, guys. Like if all we do is throw him in this pit and he dies and nobody ever finds out about it, like that's great. I mean, we got rid of him. But there's no money to be had in that. But if we sell him, we can make some money. Right? Having seen these traders, knowing they were passing through and would be leaving the area soon on their way to Egypt, and that these kind of guys would pay a fair price for a slave, Judah realizes that not only could they get rid of their brother, but they could also make a pretty good profit if they sold him to these traders as a slave. You might think of this, what could be better? Here's Judah. What could be better than robbing Joseph of his life and ending his dreams? Robbing Joseph of his life, ending his dreams, and making money doing it. That would be better, right, guys? It would be better. And so, that's what they decide to do. Why not make some money while we're at it? So that's what they do. Verse 28. Then Midianite traders. Now it says Midianites. Earlier I thought it was Ishmaelites. And then look at last half of verse 28. Ishmaelites again. Who are they selling to? Well, Ishmaelites is kind of a broader group. Those from Ishmael. Midianites were a specific group from there. So I think when they see them off on the horizon, they say, well, these Ishmaelites are coming. And Ishmaelites is a fair categorization. They were Ishmaelites, but they were once they got closer, these are specifically Midianite Ishmaelites. Right? So now the Midianites are here. The Midianites traders passed by. They didn't come into their camp. They were kind of passing by at whatever distance. Not a long distance probably, but some distance. And what did the brothers do? They drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And then they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, 20 shekels of silver, I have no way of knowing this other than relying on scholars. They say at that time this was a very fair price, kind of the going rate for a young slave. It seems that as time went on, there was some inflation. Or you might say there was wealth that was added to the land, and slaves began to demand a greater price as time went on. But at this time, this was 20 shekels was kind of the going rate. Well, we could just move on and read on, or we could stop and ask ourselves again, what does this look like? Here, Joseph, here's the rope. Does he even want to get out of there? What's next? Maybe it's like, okay, finally they're listening. They've heard me, they're going to get me out. And he comes out. Surely they can't say, here's the rope. And he says, I don't know. And they say, oh, you think it was bad before? Just wait till what happens now. Like, he's not going to come out. So they've got to coax him into coming out. So maybe sorry, Joseph, like, we shouldn't have done that, And he comes out. Because what's he going to do? Stay in there and die, right? So he comes out. And maybe they send one of them brothers down in there to grab him and tie him up and take him out. I don't know. But surely he would just willingly come out. And he gets out. And maybe there's a hug. Thank you, brothers, for listening to me. Something like this. And they say, oh no, you don't understand. Right? And they go to sell him. And what's he going to say? No, I'm not a slave. You can't sell me. Well, how many people that are sold as slaves probably say that? What do the Midianites care? All these guys are just got to say, no. I mean, you come up with a million stories for why. I mean, you drew him up out of the pit. He's all muddy and gross probably and everything. I'm not a slave. No, yeah, he wasn't a slave, but he was a common criminal. We saw him. He was stealing our things, so we threw him into the pit to die. Now we realized, hey, he deserves to die, but instead we're going to sell him. So he's yours. Fair price, what are you going to pay for him? Well, 20 shekels. Okay, done. Here, and it's off. And he's pleading with them, and they don't want to hear it. Right? And I don't know if it's exactly that way, but I mean, it's something like this. They didn't just quietly just do this thing. Something happened. It was awful. It's the kind of thing that 20 years later, the brothers, when things don't go their way, they say, God is getting after us for that day. Remember the scenes. Remember the things that were said. Remember the way He pleaded with us. Remember how callous we were to Him. God has not forgotten. It left an impression. Even these calloused men, these wicked men, could not get away from the events of that day for decades. What a thing. What sort of lies did they tell in order to sell him? Verse 29, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, and then he returned, or he found where his brothers had gone to, and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? So he tears his robes as a sign of mourning. I think there's no way for them not to realize now that his plan was to keep his brother alive for some other reason. And they're likely to have figured that out in short order. Reuben was not so concerned to rescue him. Think of this, as he does not track them down. He doesn't track the traitors down to find him. If he's really concerned with rescuing him, let's just put this to bed, that he's not a hero. He would say, he would not find him. He'd go, they'd tell him what happened, and he'd find a way to go get those Midianite traders and buy his brother back or something. Not concerned. His plan has been foiled, and he is mourning his loss. Not the loss of his brother. Not, I've lost my brother, but I've lost my brother as a way to get in with my father. His opportunity for gain within the family is gone. Where am I going to go? What am I supposed to do now? Verse 31, then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They all continued on together in the ruse. Reuben included, right, in the lie. Now think of this now. They planned to deceive their father concerning their brother. by using a slain goat and their brother's clothes. Does that ring a bell to you? Does that sound like something Jacob has done? Let's go back to Genesis 27, just 10 chapters before. Beginning in verse 8. This is Jacob's mother, Rebekah, speaking now. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself, and not a blessing. His mother said to him, Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice, and go, bring them to me. So he went and took them, and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son. Something like a long robe, maybe? His best garment? I don't know. It wouldn't have been that exactly, but I mean, whatever his best was, right? Put them on Jacob, her younger son. So this is how he deceives his father. And how do his sons deceive him? With the garments of their brother and a slain goat. It's amazing. Well, Jacob falls for it eventually, right? Because there's no DNA testing back then. There's no analyze. Well, this is animal blood. Like, it's blood, man. It's blood. It's all you knew. It's blood. Well, so here we are. Let's keep reading. So they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And now we come to scene 2, so to speak. Now we're near Hebron. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. Well, there's curious things happening here. It says they sent, and then it says they sent the robe of many colors and brought it. Well, that's kind of an odd, did you send it or did you bring it? So it might mean something like they sent it. Was there maybe some servant that they sent on ahead, that hadn't been mentioned yet before? They sent it with the servant, and then they just came and brought the news. Like the robe was there, and then the servant comes and said, "What is this?" So, I don't know. It's this. I'm not. Your sons have a message for you when they arrive, and then they show up and they say, "We found this. Is this? I mean, it's his robe, isn't it? We thought it was, but we wanted you to see it. We're worried. Did you send him out after us or something? What happened? Were you checking on us? Did you not trust us?" I mean, it's like, what in the world? So maybe that, or just saying that they sent that robe of many colors is kind of a pejorative. They sent that robe of many colors and they brought it here to their father personally. I think it's likely that they personally brought the robe. And the only reason I say that is because as calculating as these guys are, I can't see them risking sending the robe on ahead with someone who might say anything other than what their story is going to be. And they're sure not going to let Reuben take it, right, by himself. So I think it's probably they sent it on to their father. How did they do that? They brought it to him with these words. This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. So this identify, it's kind of a command. And I want to use the word recognize, right? And I'm going to use that word, or identify, recognize. What are your conclusions? Judge for yourself. What is this? Make a judgment. And I do that because it's going to become very relevant for us later on in the story. But so just let that sink in. I want you to remember this. The sons come to the father and they present the robe and say, "We found this." Recognize. Recognize it. Make a conclusion. What's your verdict? What's your judgment? What say you about what I have? And he recognized it. He identified it. He concluded and said, what was his conclusion? They didn't need to say anything more. Look what we found. And he says of his own, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." This is the part where you would like to read in the next verse. But a man came by who knew that wasn't what happened and set Jacob straight. But it wasn't. Jacob is, in fact, without doubt. He's not wondering what happened. He's without doubt about what had happened. Here he's holding in his hands the evidence. What more evidence could he need? There's no doubt. We have a certain level standard of a burden of proof in our court system. It's called beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? He has no doubts. This is what happened. He's convinced and sure of it. And there's no intervention by God to tell him otherwise. He's convinced. The one upon whom he thought was the only one who could be in the heir, the real heir, the one to carry this blessing and the mantle to the next generation, is gone. He's dead. So Jacob then, it says, then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Now, this is a cultural phenomenon that we simply don't understand. There are, not only are there places in their culture where this sort of thing happens, what I'm going to say, but even in the Bible where it's commanded, where there are, someone dies, and you make a show of your mourning. Not for attention, but it's kind of a way of demonstrating how much you honored the person who was lost and how much you missed them. So it's not just that you started crying because you were overcome with emotion, but it's almost as a matter of honoring them and as a matter of demonstrating to others just what you have lost in this death. You make a display of your grief and of your mourning. So it's kind of this mixed thing. Part of it is just the emotional upheaval, and part of it is a public display, which is not a show, but they would even hire people to come mourn. Professional lamentation people. They're lamenters. The Bible talks about bring those who are good at lamenting to come and lament and mourn and wail. Typically, so we think of a period of mourning, we might say, was the widow still in mourning? And we mean like, this might go on for a year or 2 years, something like that. The period of mourning was typically like a week or two. Now there might be elements of it that would continue, but this sort of loud lamentation and grief and fasting and the ashes and all this would go on for a week, maybe 2. Typically that would be it. Moses, when he died in the wilderness, all the nation of Israel wept for him, it says, for 30 days. And thus concluded the time of weeping and mourning for Moses, it says. 30 days. Not a pleasant 30 days. Loud lamentations being made. Now, Jacob, it says, tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. So 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month and a half. I don't know how long it was. It was a long time. Eventually, it got to where it was so long that, like, when someone's mourning like this, you don't say, no, it's okay, stop mourning, you're fine. But when it's going on, and it's kind of, should have been done like 3 weeks ago, Dad. I know, what's the deal? So all his sons and his daughters, all of them, his daughters would be here, some of his, at least one daughter that he has, right? Dinah. But then also maybe he has other daughters of his own, but likely sons and daughters, referring to his sons and their wives. All of his descendants, they all, as many as there are, they rise up to comfort him. They make effort. Oh, the duplicity. Oh, the shallow comforters they would have been. Come now, Dad. It's all right. I'm so sorry you've lost your son, but we need to move on. It's all right. All's not lost. It's absurd. Can you imagine how easy it would be to see through their pretended comforting of him? Now, maybe not all of them knew. Certainly these daughters wouldn't have known. The brothers, you can be sure, kept it as tight-lipped secret. They all rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. I'm never going to stop this kind of mourning for my son." That's incredible. It seems like he lived up to this. It seems like, as I read through just the rest of Genesis, it seems like until he met him again, he was in perpetual mourning. I'm not saying there was never any element of where he kind of backed off a little bit or let up, because you can only do this sort of thing physically for so long. But he very much was in mourning, such that later his brothers could say if he would lose Benjamin, he would die. It would be too much. He could say later of his life, "My days have been full of evil. It's been awful. Like my life has been just one continuous source of sorrow. That's been my life." What a thing. "I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." And I think you have Moses' verdict that is in fact what happened, because he says, "And thus his father wept for him." Right? He doesn't say, he doesn't just move on. He says his intention is to die, to never change. He's going to do this until, he's not like going to try to kill himself. It's not a hunger strike, but he's saying, this isn't going to end until I'm dead. I'm going to mourn him forever. That's his intention. And then Moses says, "And thus his father did weep for him." And that is how he wept. It's exactly what happened. He wept, and he wept, and he wept, and he wept. He wore sackcloth and ashes and torn garments for the rest of his days until he arrived in Egypt. What a thing. But there is this important postscript to the story, verse 36. "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." Now, Jacob says, "I shall go down to Sheol to my son." Jacob thinks, what is his conclusion? My son is dead. He's in the realm of the dead. I'm going to mourn him until I join him there in Sheol. He doesn't realize he's going to mourn until he sees his son again. But it's not going to be in Sheol. It's going to be in Egypt. His son's not in Sheol. His son, meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt. He was not in Sheol, but he was discarded and sold as a slave in Egypt. But what of his dreams, right? That was the last part. What's going to become of those dreams? Well, nothing yet, but remarkably, Joseph was sold as a slave to a man who is in the inner circle of the most powerful man on the face of the earth, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So nothing's yet, but he's a slave in this guy who has this high honor in the court of Pharaoh of being captain of the guard. He's a servant in that guy's house. The man whom he serves sees Pharaoh regularly. Is one of the most honored men in Pharaoh's court. A lot left to be seen, a lot left to happen, but it's a very intriguing issue, or statement that's made here. Verse 36, "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." All right, so what do we... So you would think we would start then with the next chapter would start with, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites." Tell that story. But instead we got Genesis 38 first. This whole story about Judah and Tamar. Before any of this. And it seems like, in one sense, it seems like an insertion. Like, why can't we just keep on with Joseph? That's one level. On another level, the fact that we leave off, let's pretend you don't know the rest of the Joseph story. The fact that we leave off here and just start talking about Judah and Tamar, it's like, it leaves you thinking, well, what in the world? There's a lot at risk here. I mean, he's just off there down in Egypt. He's never getting back to the promised land. Pharaoh's never going to... We could read it, we know the story, and we think, oh, he might get to power there. Typically, you'd read this thing and think, a rich man like that is never going to let one of his slaves go. You're never going to get him back. He's gone. He belongs to the guy who's the right hand of the king of Egypt. You can forget it. He's never coming back. That's the assumption. And then you begin to read about Judah and Tamar, and you'll see how much things are even in a worse state than we thought. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So that's where we'll be the next few weeks. Now, by way of conclusion and application for this text, I've got a couple things. Both of them are pretty hard. I mean, this text is hard, right? I mean, we end at this point, and there's nothing lively about it. There's nothing necessarily positive to say. The first thing is this: don't underestimate the depths to which hatred and jealousy will take a person. Right? So on the one level, on the one hand, we could talk about that out there. People out there, you see hatred and jealousy at work in people's hearts. Don't underestimate what that will make them capable of. Don't. I mean, Jacob sure did. He never would have sent Joseph on there if he'd have realized even half of what might have happened. Don't underestimate. But for others. But then on another level, we could say for ourselves, beware of hatred and jealousy. Like, you cannot let those things fester. You can't make peace with those things. You can't justify them or excuse them. They will drive you to these kinds of things. These are the emotions that lead people to this. Stay away from this stuff. Guard your heart. Don't let jealousy or hatred find any home in your heart. It's a frightening thing. There's a reason that God says, vengeance is mine, I'll repay. Right? Because people don't do well meting out vengeance in a just way. Right? They just don't. They did this to me, I'm going to get them back by such and such. Hey, it might start out as a small thing. Well, they did this to me, I'm going to get back at them. That attitude takes you places that are not good. And not only that, but God has said that belongs to me. And so right at the very beginning, you're robbing God of what's His. He said, vengeance is mine. I'm the one who repays. You say, no, I'm going to do it. It's not a good thing. It's a frightening thing. So that's the first thing. Just a massive caution about jealousy and hatred in the hearts of people. Your own heart and the hearts of others. The next thing, and this is a little more uncomfortable. Think about for a moment the depths of sorrow which God was willing to put Jacob through in order to bring about His purposes in the world. Like, this is awful. Probably 22 years of mourning for a lost son. Right? Alone in his family. Like, he's got all these kids, but he's got Benjamin. He's got something. He doesn't have Joseph. And all of his boys are lying. Like, he can't prove it, but everything in his gut tells him something's up. Something's wrong. It's off. This isn't good. Can't trust these guys. And it's awful. He puts them through that for 22 years, guys. What did Jacob get out of it? Nothing. He just got to see his son again. He had to move. He had to leave the promised land even to go see him. And he was terrified of doing that. God had to convince him in a dream it would be okay to go. I don't know if God had made an offer to Jacob on the front end, that he could choose Esau instead. Esau could be the one. But if Jacob wanted to be the one, he'd have to go through all these kinds of things. I don't know what Jacob would have chosen. I don't know. Jacob didn't have a choice. That's the reality. He didn't have a choice. God chose for him. And it was hard. I mean, you can't read this text and not see how grieved he is. And thus he wept for him. No doubt it had been the hardest thing of his life. Harder than losing Rachel. Very, very hard. And God willingly puts him through it for 22-ish years to bring about his purposes. It's one thing when we talk about the providence of God, we will say things like, God works all things together for good. And we mean for me, right? Like God works everything in my life together for my good. And that's true, ultimately. And for Jacob, that's true. But in another sense, we look through this and we think, well, he didn't really, what did he really get out of this? Well, he got just things are a little closer to being fulfilled. And he got that, one day the Messiah is going to come and you're going to have, you're going to sit in the kingdom of heaven, and that's great. But those things were kind of they were out there ahead of time. It's like, couldn't we have found another route to get to those things? Do we have to do this? Have to? I don't know. God wanted it. God chose it. There are things for Jacob to learn. There's just grief for Jacob to experience. There's grief, beloved, let's apply it for us to experience. There's hardships. Paul himself, right? He's got this thorn in the flesh, and he's praying to God. Remove it, remove it, remove it. 3 times he prays this way. God says, no, my grace is enough. You're a recipient of my grace. I'm working through you. I'm using you in this world. Be content with that. This is enough. Stay humble and just endure this thing. It's just there to keep you humble, to make you susceptible to the charges of other people, to make it where other people can make fun or look at your weakness. That the only thing that anybody has to look at you for is just when my power is upon you, because you have nothing to offer outside of that. Okay, who wants to sign up for that? Right? Well, Lord, put me in a position where I have nothing, and all I have is you, and anyone ever looks to me for anything, it's because they must be wanting God, because there's nothing in me that anyone would find desirable. That's a hard place to be. You can see why you would pray for God to remove that, because you don't want it, but you didn't have a choice. Jesus tells Peter, here's how you're going to die. Peter says, well, what about him? I don't want to die like that. He says, well, what, are you going to follow me or not? What does it matter to you if he lives forever and never dies? What does that matter to you? Are you willing to make this exchange? Are you going to live for me, come what may, or not? And I just say we see with Jacob a vivid demonstration of this, that like going on with God, being the recipient of God's grace may mean something like this for you. Now it works out in the end, ultimately. The end might be the resurrection. We know, in one sense we know that's the case, because it's not until then that the scales of justice are balanced. It's not until then that rewards are given. It's not until then that the resurrection happens. You can't say, well, by the end of my life it'll all be okay. Maybe not. Beloved, we have a glimpse into people like that in Revelation. They're all around the throne of God, and they're saying, how long, O Lord, until you vindicate our blood? Right? So it's not going to be made, you're not going to get to the end of your life and think, now I see what God was doing and it all worked out and I'm happy. That's not going to happen. It won't. You're storing up treasure in heaven, right? So I would say it's not easy, but just try to get comfortable with this expectation. Things are going to be hard. Your life's going to be full of grief and heartache and difficulty. That's how this works. If you're going to pursue the things of God, that's just the way it's going to be. God didn't choose the easy path, the straight direction, right? That's not the way it goes. There are far too many things God means to do in the meantime to just take you from point A to point B. He's got all these other people He wants you to interact with, lessons He wants you to learn, prayers He wants you to pray, interactions between you and Him, deep things between you and God that need to take place before you get there. And even when you get there, you might think, well, this wasn't all that I thought it was going to be. This is just point B. He says, yeah, we're going on to Z. Just be patient. We'll get there, right? So may the Lord help us with this. We don't usually read any of the story of Joseph from anyone's perspective but Joseph, right? We just think of it, oh, he was sold into slavery, but look, he triumphed, he was exalted, and look all the great things he was able to do. But look at Jacob. He lost his son. And all he really got in exchange was just, he got him back later. He learned what it was to be comforted by God alone. That's what he learned. Everyone else in his house rose up to try to comfort him, and they couldn't do it. So, anyway. Well, are there questions or comments on the material today? Things we've covered from this chapter?